Oshio, here's Josh here. I wanted to share with you guys a little bit about Cherokee history and a lot of things I've been finding out, which is very fascinating. I'm down here at Indian Creek here, and at the Old Man Willow. It's really old, kind of like 100-year-old willow tree that's just growing out of the river. It's a beautiful, peaceful place, and what a perfect place to share with you about like the 9 different books I've read about Cherokee history. Now, I grew up in Cherokee Nation, and I learned a lot about the Cherokee Nation just as growing up. My grandmother taught me about the Trail of Tears, about our own personal family history connected to that, and just the cultural kind of collective vibe that came off that. So I kind of knew some basic overall pieces of it, but I really wanted some more details. And so I started digging in this last year and a half and digging and reading. That's kind of what I do, right? So one of the books I think was really one of the better ones. It's an easy read. It really kind of gets it in there. It's by Robert Conley. It's actually called The Cherokee Nation of History, published in 2005. I don't have a copy in front of me. I checked mine out from the library, which I don't actually have right now. Hopefully you guys can find it. This was commissioned by the Cherokee Nation itself in the 90s and 80s, and actually Conley, he's a writer. He writes a lot of westerns and really kind of has a really good portrayal of the Cherokees. He's actually a Cherokee descendant himself. I think United Kilaway, I believe, is where his background is in it. But it's a really fascinating book commissioned by the Cherokees for the Cherokees, and actually gives a good input about the entire kind of general history of it. Great intro read to it. Now, being a little bit crazy, I'm a little nerdy, and I really want the details. So I went all the way back to 1775. That's right, 1775 is the 18th century, to a guy named James Adair. James Adair actually had a book called The History of the American Indian, and it was actually kind of a fascinating read. It's one of the first actually ever published about kind of the Cherokees, the Creek, the Choctaws, Seminoles, and all kind of different areas of the southeastern Indians. He was a British trader that kind of intermarried in place. Adair County in Oklahoma is named after his descendants, because he really kind of got his descendants kind of really played a part in the Cherokee Nation for many, many, many years and generations ago from it there. Now, it is kind of an odd read, because he's trying really hard to prove that the American Indians are Hebrew. So he says that they are actually the lost tribes of Israel, which is crazy, because there is no lost tribes. If you actually read the New Testament, they show up in Matthew, Mark, Luke. There actually is some lost tribes in there, so quote unquote. So they never really were lost. But people kind of had that theory that maybe the Americans they're trying to actually place us in their kind of grid work. So he had a lot of things in that nature. And so it's kind of odd in that sense, and kind of see that kind of 18th century vibe. But it's fascinating from a cultural point of view. This will kind of get there. Now, another really good book I actually enjoy, and this one I actually enjoy most, is James Moody. He was an Irishman, Irish-American who came in, ethnocer, and he wrote a book. And he actually had a couple books here. You see, now I've talked about it before. The History, Myths, and Sacred Formulas of the Cherokees. It was 1900s when he wrote one of them. I think it was like 1891, the first one came out. And he documents a lot of the stories, the myths, creations, and different places of the Cherokee Nation, as well as the history of it. Fascinating. It really traces it from kind of the 1600s, late 1600s, when really the Europeans started connecting with it. The Shoots actually came in, I think in 1500s, the Spanish kind of made their trip through it. My own ancestors kind of joined in about 1690s, 1700s. It's kind of hard to tell, but that's when they really kind of came in from Ireland and actually intermarried into the Cherokee Nation as well. But a fascinating book, really detailed. There's a lot of vibes into it, places. The other really good one I actually recommend, he wrote a bunch of them, is William Mahulan. He actually was a Brown University professor, and he wrote a whole bunch of books in the Cherokee. This one's Cherokee Renaissance and New Republic. And it really kind of documents the Cherokee Nation from about 1794. That's when we lost the war from the American side and really started becoming dependent upon the U.S. government and really having to shift our culture. And within a generation, we actually then went from our old way of doing traditional things. We actually adopted a written constitution. We made our own language, Sequoia. We actually had our judicial system, a law system, a Congress, a House Representative, a president that we call it the chief. All this stuff was put in within about a very short period of time. And Ewan really kind of talks through it and really documents all the entire procedure, as well as even how Christianity was introduced into the Cherokee tribe and the place that it played in a place. So it was fascinating, very detailed, very fun story. Now, as a follow-up to that one here, he actually had another book called After the Trail of Tears. And this one here really kind of follows it from 1839 to about 1880. And this really kind of shows about what happens after they left out of the Georgia, Carolina area and went to Oklahoma Indian Territory and the fight for sovereignty that we had in the place. Now, this is really fascinating. It actually reads like a really political novel in some ways, but I had studied a lot of European history and even American history and British history, and you really kind of see even the Roman Empire. You have different fractions and political groups and places. You think about what's happening right now with our Republicans and Democrats, independents, and all the different places happening in our political system. Now put that into the Cherokee Nation, and that was the same. And there was a treaty party, and there were Old Settlers, and then the Ross Party, and all these different fractions kind of playing off of it. And then you even had the fact that they were surrounded not just by the United States, but even by Mexico, then there's Republic of Texas, and the other Indian tribes all around there. And it really is a fascinating, detailed look about what happens when the tribe fight for their own independence and fights for the rights to be able to declare who's a citizen, who's not a citizen, and how that places in their really cool book on that can. Now, the third of his kind of, I call him a kind of a trilogy, not really, but a little bit, is he wrote another book. This one's actually got a little piece of paper coming out, but this was actually written. It was kind of a series of essays that he actually wrote that was then put into a book format. And it's called, Cherokees and Christianity from 1794 to 1870. And he really, again, documents the different ways of the Christianity, the missionaries who came in, some of which actually adopted the Cherokee way of looking, the Cherokee language. A bunch of them did not. And they tried to actually incarcerate and make us into little Europeans and all that kind of stuff. But another one kind of fills in the gaps from his other ones from kind of a Christianity point of view and really kind of looks at that. So, again, a really kind of fascinating look on there. Now, all in there, I think, is some other ones that kind of looks at that same period of time. And one is, we had a guy by the name of Gregory Smithers, and he made a book in 2015, a phenomenal book. And I'll talk about it later for something else. Again, I don't actually have a copy because I left in the library. But it's called the Cherokee Dispersia, an Indigenous History of Migration, Resettlement, and Identity. And at that book, he really kind of talks about what happens in that a 19th century, 1800s, when the Cherokee Nation was fighting for independence. Who was a Cherokee? Was it the freemen, the extra slaves that they had? Because the Cherokee Nation, for those who don't know, actually adopted that black slavery kind of components to it, and they actually had places, and they were trying to say, are we not really white, or is it African, or Indian, or how the places, and really kind of struggle with who are we, and still even today, if who's a Cherokee, and what does it mean to be Cherokee, which again is another video, another time. Really good ideas in that one. But Smither has a really good book on that piece that comes out. All those are kind of books of note that I think should be kind of mentioned in there. Is actually, you see a lot of Grace Steele Wooder has a book from 1963 called The Cherokees. This one gets a lot of press. You see, it's kind of an older book in this, well, not as old as like maybe 1775, but it was actually a really popular one. You see that one referenced on the Eastern Tribes Cherokee website, as well as Cherokee Nation website. It's actually really well done, except there are parts where you see kind of a little bit of derogatory terms, a little bit to the Indians, where we're talking about civilizing them and making them kind of more European and stuff. So there's a couple of wordings and different things that kind of make me like kind of cringe a little bit. But again, she's a product of that kind of that late 50s, early 60s kind of vibe comes into it. Now, from a Cherokee point of view, I already talked about Robert Connolly. He actually wrote the commission from the Cherokee Nation, his history. Now, he actually sometimes billed as the first Cherokee to write a history of the Cherokee Nation. And that's not quite true, because there actually was one other Cherokee that did wrote. He just wrote at the turn of the century. So in 1917, Emmett Starr wrote the early history of the Cherokees. And then in 1921, he wrote the history of the Cherokee Indians, a legend and folklore. Now, both of those were commissioned by one of the, what ends up being one of the chiefs of the Cherokee Nation there. And he wrote in there, he provides a lot of joggers, family history, so a lot of different family records about this son was married who and everything else. So there's a lot of that in there. So a lot of people who are tracing their family tree use Starr's book really, really heavily to be able to find and connect the dots to their family. But in those books, he actually does document a lot of the history of the people. He provides a lot of documentations, a lot of history, a lot of commentary, as well as reposting just a lot of the actual official documents from that time period. So it's a great source of history and a great one to read as well. And he, I think, really was the first Cherokee to really document himself and kind of pull that in there in kind of concise basis. And I know Connolly kind of later on in the 2000s actually wrote then his part of it. So again, lots of good books, a lot of places to read it. It gets really fascinating to understand this one, especially you start thinking about the Cherokee Nation in the sense of, you know, you think of the history of America, the history of Great Britain, the history of France and stuff. You see the common people, you see the political elite, you see the rich on the top, you see the poor, you see this different entracing between the different places. And it really is a fascinating kind of combination of that. So that's like 9 different books I just went through, so I know there's a lot of information. One of these days I have to come back and summarize the history itself. But those are some great books that I have for the Cherokee Nation, so I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you do, just like my page and hang out. And so anyway, Waldo.